Hello everyone, welcome to what is going to now be the fifth video in the Tamerlane chess YouTube series. This video, unlike the first three, which were mostly just explaining the rules of the game, and the fourth one, which answered a few questions people had about the game, this video I'm going to try to go into a little bit more about a few things about actual strategy and tactics in Tamerlane chess. Because regular chess, we know there's hundreds of books on this, and Tamerlane chess, not so much. There's not a lot written about what kind of tactics there are in the game, because there's only perhaps 36 of us on Earth that are nerdy enough to play it. So obviously no books have been written on this. So this video is going to be more dedicated to just a little bit of what I've picked up in my time playing Tamerlane chess so far. But before I get into tactics, I do want to mention one thing first quickly. It's a clarification of, and maybe possibly a correction of, something that I said in an earlier video. If you remember, now this video is going to assume that you already remember the moves of the pieces and their shapes, what they look like, and what each piece's move is. So if at this point you need a brush up on that, I suggest going through, listening to some of the earlier videos again, getting to memorize the moves of the pieces, and then come back to this video. But the one thing I want to show you before we go into tactics is, if you remember, the pawn of pawns, when he promotes all the way to the other side of the board, he becomes immune there. And then in the earlier videos, I told you that at that point, whenever a situation comes up where he can either fork two of his opponent's pieces or attack one of his opponent's pieces that is immobile, that he must do that. He's obligated to do that. So he comes here, remains immune there, but as soon as a situation arises where he can fork two of his opponent's pieces like that, there he's forking the giraffe and the knight, he must go there and do that. The first translation of the manuscript 211 that I read, used the word must in the translation, which is why I presented it as an obligation that they must do it. I have since read another translation by another author of manuscript 211, and in the other translation, he uses the word may, that the pawn may do this instead of must, which indicates that he is not obligated to go immediately to fork two of his opponent's pieces or to go to an immobile piece. But he may do it. He may choose to do it if the situation comes up. So I just wanted to point that out first before we get into tactics, as a kind of expansion of an earlier thing I said. So you can either choose to play the game the way I described it earlier, where you must do it, or you can choose to play the game where it's an option. The player may take his pawn from the square up here and move it to fork in the opponent's pieces when the situation comes up. He can choose to do that at any given time, is another alternative to play. So now that that's out of the way, I'll just put the pieces back where they belong here. And now to get into the first thing people really need to know, if they're going to even talk about strategy and tactics in a chess game, is the relative value of the pieces. In chess, we know the general convention is that the queen is 9, the rook is worth 5, the knight and the bishop are both worth 3. And these are just general values. I mean, it depends on the situation that's going on in the game at the time, you know. It depends on how the pieces are set up on the board at any given time, and what piece you're going to use to your advantage can change the values of the pieces. But in general, as a general rule, in chess, they have those values listed as the values for the pieces. In Tamerlane chess, we're going to try to go through and see if we can come up with an assignment for the values of the pieces. That's kind of the first basic thing you have to do, and it tells you whether or not a piece is good to trade. When you're trading pieces, decide if you can grab another of the opponent's piece and in essence lose your piece and make a trade. The question becomes, is it worth it to do that or not in any given situation? And obviously, in order to answer that question, you've got to have a sense for what the value of each piece is. So the first thing I'm going to do to begin to get into that is to let you know that in addition to the king and the pawns, there are 9 pieces in Tamerlane chess that move in 9 different ways. These pieces are the rook, the knight, the talia, which is the piece that moves like the bishop, the giraffe, the furs or minister, the vizier, the elephant, the camel, and the dababa, or war machine. Those are the 9 different pieces in Tamerlane chess in addition to the king and the pawns. And those 9 pieces can be grouped into 3 different groups. They can be grouped into the pieces that move straight on the board. They can be grouped into the 3 pieces that move diagonally along the board, or obliquely, and then the 3 pieces that have the knight-like move, or the L-shape type move, like the knight. So if we take the 3 pieces that can move straight, they are the rook, the dababa, and the vizier that sits on the right side of the king. The rook, in each group of 3 that have pieces that move similar to each other, within that group, you have the piece that moves a short distance, the piece that moves an intermediate or middle distance, and the piece that moves the long distance. So in this group of 3 right here, the pieces that move straight, you have the short piece is the vizier. He just moves 1 square in each direction, and that's it. The intermediate piece would be the war machine, or dababa. He jumps 2 squares straight in any direction. He moves the intermediate move. And of course, the long piece is the rook. He moves as far as he wants straight. So he's the long piece within that group. Now, those are the 3 for the pieces that move straight. What are the 3 in the group for the pieces that move diagonally? Well, they are the talia, which is our piece that's closest to the bishop. They are the vizier, the furs, which sits on the left side of the king. And there is the elephant. Those are the 3 pieces that move diagonally. The short one is the furs. He moves 1 square diagonally. That's it. The intermediate one is the elephant. He jumps 2 squares diagonally. And the long one is the picket, which is our piece that's close to the bishop. He moves at least 2 squares diagonally, cannot jump, and then continues after that to move like a bishop as long as he wants across the board. So we have the short, the intermediate, the elephant, and the long, the picket, a bishop-like piece. So to put those back, those are the 3 that move obliquely. And then there's the 3 that make the L shape, or the horse-like move, the knight-like move, which are the knight, of course, the camel, and the giraffe. Knight is the short one. He moves like a regular knight in chess. The intermediate is the camel, who moves like a knight stretched like 1, so he would go from here to this piece. And the long is the giraffe, who's a knot jumper, but he moves diagonally 1 by at least 3 straight, so he can move here first and then can continue to move like a rook. He's the long. So we have the short, middle, and long of the L-shaped move. So those are kind of the theory of how the pieces are grouped together. So they didn't actually just throw a bunch of random pieces together. They actually have kind of a pattern to how they move. So now if we look at that written down, you can see it's kind of like this. The straight pieces, you have the primary, middle, and long, the vizier, war machine, and rook. You have the diagonal, oblique. The short is the furs, middle, elephant. Long is the talia. And you have the horse-like or mixed move. The short is the knight, the middle is the camel, and the long is the giraffe. So how much are these pieces worth in relation to each other? Well, here's just partly my theory of what I've come up with in playing the game so far. Let's compare the knight to the camel. Now the knight moves like a regular knight in chess. He can land on every square on the board. There's 110 squares, not counting the citadels in Tamerlane chess. The knight can move on every square of the board. He starts out on a light square, jumps to a dark square. That's why I use the checkered board for this demonstration, so it's easier to see this. From the dark square, he can jump back to a light square. From there, he can jump back to a dark square. So he can land on light and dark squares, all 110 squares. Let's see if that's the case with the camel. He starts on a light square and ends on a light square. He starts on a light square and would jump to a light square. He can only land on the same color squares that he starts on in the beginning of the game. He can only land on half the squares on the board. So out of 110 squares, the camel is limited to 55 squares. Of course, he has a little bit longer range move than the knight, which means he can move across the board a little bit more efficiently, get from one side to the other. He also has a little bit more of an element of surprise than the knight, I think, because he can come from relatively far away and really quickly come up and start kind of attacking some of the opponent's pieces when maybe he wasn't expecting it. Because he can jump a little longer, get to places faster, you may surprise your opponent a little bit more with the camel. However, for me, I think that's offset by the fact that he's limited to half the squares on the board, where the knight can go on all the squares on the board. So to me, I would always trade my camel for a knight. If I have an ability to grab the other person's knight with my camel, but then lose and lose my camel in the process, I would make that trade. I would take the opponent's knight and in essence then lose my camel. To me, that is a good trade because the camel only lands on half the squares on the board. That's my reasoning for those. Now, the value of the giraffe, the long knight move piece, is a little bit more complicated because he's a weak piece at the beginning of the game. He is a non-jumper, which means he easily gets trapped. He has to move at least one square diagonally, followed by 3 straight. So if you're to the situation, say like this, and you bring out your giraffe, slide him to the other side of the board, and he's, let's say the situation's like that, and this piece is here. All I have to do and he wants to make his next move by going diagonal and escaping through here to maybe attack a piece on this side of the board. All your opponent has to do is move this piece forward. Maybe he can't capture the piece right away, and this time he can because the knight can capture. But even if there's a situation where he might not be able to capture your giraffe right away, all he has to do is move a piece into this square. There, that giraffe is trapped. He can go nowhere. He is now immobilized, and your opponent will probably eventually capture him. So if you move out your giraffe too early in the game, you essentially have a high chance of losing it. However, near the end game, when there's not a lot of pieces left on the board, he becomes almost as strong, in my opinion, as the rook, because he can control from this square right here with not a lot of pieces left. He can control both these files right here and trap a piece like the king right in the middle, just by that one piece, because he controls from here on over. He controls both these columns. So he becomes a very strong piece near the end of the game. So I think his value almost kind of changes and gets greater as the game goes on. Same thing, another concept here is the dababa. The dababa, because he can only jump 2 squares straight, also you'll notice can always only land on the same color square that he starts on. Always, in this scenario, he'll always land on the light square. And not only that, but if he's sitting here, he can never land on this light square. He can land on these 4, but no matter what, no time in the game can he land on this. So not only is he limited to the light squares, he's limited to only a little bit more than half the light squares. And in actuality, out of 110 squares on the board, the dababa can only land on 30. 30 out of 110, and he doesn't have a very powerful move, to be honest. That's his only move, is jumping. So because of those 2 limitations, he's not very powerful. He's limited to 30 out of 110 squares. He's a fairly weak piece, one of the weaker pieces on the board. The elephant, I believe, is even weaker, possibly the weakest piece on the board. He, the elephant, also limited to his own color, diagonal. But even there's a very few squares that he can even land on of his own color. And in fact, he can only land on a total out of 110 squares. The elephant can only land on 15 squares on the board. He'll only ever land on 15 squares on the board out of 110, making him, in my opinion, an extremely weak piece. And we discussed that a little bit previously. So now let's look at the values of the pieces that the computer software program Zillions of Games has assigned to Tamerlane chess pieces. In the book A World of Chess, Its Development and Variations Through Centuries and Civilizations, a book that was written by Gene Cazot and Rick Knowlton, they used Zillions of Games, a computer program, to plug in how the pieces moved in relation to the game, and the computer program came up with this set of values for each piece. They initially set the rook, which is the strongest piece on the board because there's no queen. They set the rook at 5, and then they calculated using the software what each piece would be in relation to the strongest piece on the board compared to the rook. So let's investigate that. The computer program came up with a rook being 5, or they set it at 5 points. So the computer program came up with the war machine compared to the rook being only 1.45. And as we said, the war machine's limited to 30 squares on the board. It has a fairly weak move. So I think that's pretty in agreement. It's quite a bit weaker than the rook. The vizier is the piece that can only move 1 square straight. It has a weak move. It has a short move, very weak. However, its advantage is that because it can move 1 square straight, it can land on all 110 squares on the board. It can go anywhere. It can be anywhere on the board, which I think strengthens it in compared to the war machine. Even though it's a very short move, I think it's strong in comparison to the War Machine because it essentially can end up going anywhere. And they do make it a little bit stronger. The computer program makes it 1.65 compared to 1. I probably would have made it closer to maybe 1.8 or 2 to get a little bit of a more distinction between those two pieces. But it seems what the computer program came up with seems pretty good so far. So now let's look at the knight-like or the L-shaped moves. The knight is the one that can land on all the squares on the board. It can land on all 110. They gave it a 2.6. Now they give the camel almost the same score as a knight, a 2.3, which he does have an advantage of, like I said, more element of surprise because he has a longer range move. But because he's limited to only half the squares on the board, my opinion is there should be a little bit of a bigger distinction between the knight and the camel in terms of figuring out whether you should trade and the point value. So I actually would call the knight an even 3. I would give him a value just to give him a little bit more of a distinction from the camel. So you'd always want to, in my opinion, I would trade my camel away to get a knight. The giraffe gave almost the same value as the camel, 2.25. Now I think he might even be weaker than that early in the game. He might even be down in the 1 point something range. But at the end of the game, as I said, he gets very strong when he can no longer be trapped. And in my experience of playing this game, when you're down to the end game and there's only a few pieces left, I think the giraffe is pretty much almost as strong as the rook. So for particularly end game value, I'm going to give him a 4. I think he's a 4 near the end game and a 2.25 at the beginning. Let's look at the pieces that move obliquely, diagonally. The furs is the piece that just jumps 1 square diagonally, but he can land on half the squares of the board. So he is probably a little bit stronger than the vizier. See, well, they have the furs being a little bit weaker, which is, yeah, correct. From the vizier, who can land on, only moves 1 space, but can land on all the squares on the board. They gave him a 1.65. The furs, they gave a little bit weaker because he has the weak move of 1 square down. He can only land on half. So I agree with that. The elephant, you can see he has the lowest score of anyone so far, which I agree with. As we showed, he only lands on 15 squares on the board. The computer program gave him a 1.15. Now, the interesting one that I really disagree with is the Talia, the piece that moves like the bishop. They gave him almost the same score as the elephant. The elephant that can only land on 15 squares on the board. Now, the bishop is limited to having to move at least 2 squares. He has to move at least 2 squares, and then he can continue on after that. So he has a limitation compared to the modern bishop in the sense that he can't capture the piece right next to him. He has to move at least 2 and then keep sliding. And it also makes him a little easier to be trapped because he has to move at least 2. But he's, in my experience playing the game, he's a pretty strong piece. He's one that's used a lot, just like the bishop is used a lot in the game. He can pin pieces because of the move of the bishop. He can go all the way across the board. He has an element of surprise. He's a pretty useful piece, far more useful in my experience than the elephant, which is only used maybe towards the end of the game when you don't have a lot of pieces left. So I can't imagine that he has pretty much the same score as the elephant. And I am going to raise him to about a 2.2. I'm going to give him a whole extra point. Instead of calling him a 1.2, I'm going to call him a 2.2. Now, if you notice, this distinguishes him from the knight, which I called a 3. In modern chess, they consider the knight about equal to the bishop. Here, obviously, I've made the bishop weaker because of his limitation of having to move at least 2 squares. So I would always capture a bishop if I was going to lose my knight. That's another trade that I would do. I would capture a bishop and lose my knight. Excuse me, I said that backwards. I would capture a knight and lose my Talia, lose my bishop. That would be a good trade because I think the knight is a stronger piece on the board because of the limitations the Talia has compared to the modern bishop in this game. Okay, so if you want to memorize it or pause the video and write this down, to just an idea, these are the relative values that I think is the best we're going to come up with at the moment for deciding when you're going to trade pieces and what the relative values are, just to get an idea for trading tactics. Okay, so after we've done the relative values of the pieces, you know, in modern chess, there's always those tricks that you do to beginning players. There's the checkmate in 2 moves, the checkmate in 4 moves, and they're tricks that you kind of use on beginners. Is there anything like that in Tamerlane chess that we've come across in our time of playing? And the answer is yes, there's at least one. And it has to do with the camel. The camel starting position is here in relation to the board, you can see. And one thing I've noticed is if you jump with your camel and make your first move to jump to this square here, the square that's a little bit closer to the edge of the board, jump your camel there, and on your very next move, swing it towards the middle of the board in this kind of horizontal move here, from this square to here. Now, can you see by looking at the board, if you want to pause the video at all, can you see which piece that camel is really putting in danger? Which is the strongest piece on the board that camel is very much putting in danger if the opponent doesn't do something to protect it? Doesn't look like it's going to really do too much from here, but if you've thought about it, if the opponent doesn't do something about it to prevent this, and on the next move I swing my camel to this square right here, you'll notice that now he has absolutely no way to save his rook. The rook is the strongest piece on the board. It's trapped. It can't move. There's nothing here that can capture my camel. There's nothing here that can block it because the camel's a jumper. So in the next move after that, the camel will inevitably capture the rook. Now, sure, in the meantime, you might lose the camel. He might trap your camel in there and you might lose it in the long run. But the rook is a much stronger piece than the camel. It's about double the value. So that is kind of a trick at the beginning of the game. Within 1, 2, 3 moves, you've now, unless they have done something to prevent this, such as move this pawn forward and give the rook an escape, unless they've done something like that to prevent it, once you land here, it's too late. He moves this pawn forward to attack you. That's fine, but you can still get him. So that's a 4-move capture of your opponent's rook if they are kind of a beginner and have never seen that before. Okay, I've set up the board here now. We're getting towards an endgame. Endgame where black is quite outnumbering white with its powerful pieces. He's still got a rook left. He's got his giraffe. He's got a knight. The pieces of the white are now just the king and a couple very weak pieces. The elephant, the furs, the dababa. White's obviously going to lose this game if he doesn't get a draw. Remember, the way to get a draw is to get your king into your opponent's citadel. So white has to get in the citadel over there. But another rule that you can combine that with is that remember the first time the king is put in check, checkmate, or stalemate, because stalemate is a loss in this game if you get stalemated. The first time the king is put in check, checkmate, or stalemate, he's allowed to switch with one of his other pieces to escape it just one time. Now, why bother to do that? Just to prolong the inevitable? Sure, I can put this king in check. He can switch with one of these, and then it might prolong the game a little bit, but he's still going to lose in the end, probably, unless he can get his king to his opponent's citadel. So if you put those two facts together, your king switch with your citadel draw, what you want to start doing towards the end of the game, if you think you're in a position where it's becoming hopeless and you're going to lose, it's advantageous to get one of your pieces in the general facility of your opponent's citadel, so when inevitably you do get put in check, or if you want to be tricky, maybe even do it sooner, if you get it put in checkmate, or if you want to be tricky and do it even sooner when you're put in check, when your opponent might not be expecting you to use your king switch quite yet. When you're getting into this situation, you want to start working one of your other pieces towards the citadel, because that's the piece you're going to want to switch with. So let's say it's white's turn, he's losing. He's going to use his dababa to capture that pawn. His opponent's probably going to think, oh, he got my pawn, no big deal. You know what, I'm going to start putting him in check. Now suddenly, I put his king in check. I might not be expecting him to use his switch quite yet, because I've only put him in check, not checkmate. But he tricks me by saying, oh, I'm going to use my switch, and I'm switching with that dababa that's way over here. And why am I switching with that dababa that's way over here? Now look how close I am to the citadel. I wasn't expecting it because I didn't have him in checkmate yet. The question is, can I stop him from getting to the citadel now? Now, in this case, I can probably. Let's see. Now it's my move. I'm going to want to come down here to the farthest square. He's going to move one more towards the citadel. I'm going to come over here. Okay. He can try to move here. He cannot move here because that's covered by the giraffe. He cannot move here or here to get closer to the citadel because that's covered by my rook. So right now it looks like I'm going to be able to stop him from getting to the citadel. But another situation, say if this had been in the way, if there had been a piece of mine that was in the way, if this giraffe wasn't here, another piece of mine was in the way, and I wasn't able to swing my rook down in a way that would be able to stop him, I can go there, but he could have still come here, here, and then slid in diagonally. I may not have been able to stop him from getting into the citadel. So a trick is when you're losing, another tactic, and you think it's getting hopeless, get one of your pieces somehow, use an excuse to get one of your pieces down here towards the opponent's citadel, and then when the first time you're put in check, switch it and have a hope that you can run and get in there before the person can stop it. And the video is getting long. It's over 20 minutes now, which is twice what I was planning when I started the video. So I'll leave it at that. It was just a few things, the piece values and a couple tactics, and the clarification about the pawn of pawns. And maybe another video soon will come out. Maybe we'll talk about another topic like Tamerlane chess notation or something along those lines. And thank you much. We'll see you soon.